Hey everyone. So, how much violence do you like in your comics? How much transgressive, disturbing stuff do you like in comics? And does it make sense in some comics and not fit right in other comics? I stopped. Let's see. What was I gonna say? I stopped buying Demon Knights of all things, which I was enjoying a lot, when Robert Venditti took it over and there was a torture scene, and not only was it a torture scene, but it was explained to us that this torture was going on for decades. And I'm a wuss about torture. I don't like things with torture in it. In comic books, it's probably not as bad as like if I were reading it in a novel or seeing it in a movie. Once as a kid, as a teenager, I read about tortures that they did in the Tower of London, and I couldn't sleep for 3 days after that. I just am very disturbed by the idea of torture. I think it's one of the truly great crimes that a human can commit against another human. It's very disturbing. And I think I particularly dislike it when torture is played as a kind of a light throwaway kind of thing. Earlier, when Paul Cornell was still doing, and I think the very first issue of the Demon Knights in the New 52, he had the bad guys explode a baby. And that was done fairly lightly, almost humorously, perhaps humorously. At least the villains not caring about it seemed kind of funny. And I was pretty disturbed by that, but I kept going, and there wasn't much else that bothered me that way until the torture happened. And I don't even know if I finished the comic book. I just sort of said, well, this isn't for me. And as you kind of see, this may be not a video to watch in mixed company, and there may be some sexual stuff that I'll discuss too. There's a graphic novel by a very well-known a Batman graphic novel by a very well-known writer, by some artists I really like. And twice in bookstores I picked it up, flipped through it, and each time I end up almost immediately on this picture of a hideously tortured person who's obviously been tortured beyond endurance and just grotesque. And I immediately shut the book and put it down. And like several months later, I picked up the same book thinking, well, it can't be that bad, or let me look at other parts of the book. And boom, opened right up to that picture, shut it, put it down, couldn't take it. So yeah, I just can't take that kind of thing. I guess I love horror movies, but there's certain horror movies that are labeled as torture porn. I stay away from that. So obviously I can accept all kinds of violence. I read violent comic books. I love Conan. So I've read all kinds of violent stuff. But there's certain things that just hit me the wrong way, and then I find it very hard to take. And I thought of this most recently because I had grabbed Ghosted #1 and #2, and I've only read a little ways. I've only read about half of #1, or maybe 2/3 of it, and it's very good, and I really like the art. And if you look at the art, it's not superhero comic book art, but it's pretty familiar looking standard comic book art. But on the very first page, the splash page, takes place in prison, and we clearly see, there's a character in the foreground, but right behind him is one prisoner raping another prisoner, and we very clearly see it. We don't see the penetration, but it's very clear what's happening. There's a look of intense pain and humiliation on the rapee's part. We're talking about a man raping a man. And the one who's doing the raping is pointing to our main character, who's in the foreground, saying, "You're next." And in a way, it's kind of funny, and there's a whole cultural thing now about making jokes about prison rape, which is probably not a great thing to make jokes about, and hopefully doesn't increase our society's acceptance of that as just part of what you have to go through in prison, and the acceptance of the people who run prisons of that. Because to me, rape is a form of torture, and torture is awful. Sexual humiliation is awful. It's just as bad if it happens to a man or a woman, I believe. It seems kind of played for laughs in Ghosted, and it feels very transgressive to me, to use a fancy word, which is often a word you might use about underground comics and other kind of extreme comics. It feels very transgressive, particularly when put on the splash page or the first page, and kind of shocking to me in a comic book that looks like this in the standard format. I've in the past, I've liked underground comics that do really radical things. And some of them, maybe if I thought too deeply about them, maybe I would back down on liking them. There's some things that Robert Crumb has done that are questionable, but one kind of accepts that he's exploring his id and stuff. He's not reflecting the real world directly. Where Ghosted lies in terms of its reflection of the real world, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if prison rapes take place in the kind of scenario he's set up there. In a very public way. Yeah, so why is I like there as especially in college, there were still head shops in my college town, and I would go into them to look for underground comics, and I found quite a few, and underground comics, at least still then, maybe the very early 80s, they were reprinted over and over again, so you could find the old Zap comics and old things with Richard Corbin and other weird stuff, and the Fury Freak brothers, that were 5 or 6 years old, but were still in circulation in the head shops, or I should say maybe 10 or 12 years old. That the people like Zap Comics have just kept reprinting issues 1, 2, and 3 and sending them out to head shops. And so I managed to get a hold of the infamous S. Clay Wilson comic book, where I think it's pirates. One of them lays his enormous penis out on a bar, and the other character chops it off with a sword and eats it. So that was kind of thrilling to me at the time, the ultimate in sort of transgressive kind of images that you wouldn't see anywhere. And there's so far anyway, no penises showing. They keep them hidden there. But somehow I found that totally acceptable for me. I mean, yes, it gave me the transgressive thrill at the time, which was more meaningful to me when I was 19 than now. But, it was, and also back then, it was a new thing for me anyway, to see anything close to that in comic books. I suppose heavy metal was also kind of transgressive and had stuff like that. So why do I find that acceptable, but I have trouble accepting sort of violent yet lightly glossed over prison rape in Ghosted? I don't seem to have trouble accepting a lot of blood and gore in Clone. It just seems to fit what they're doing, and the kind of artwork in it and everything works right for me. So it's definitely a tonal thing, although on top of that, as I said, if there's a sense of torture, prolonged agony and unpleasantness for people, that strikes me as real. If Superman is being zapped by a beam by Brainiac and is in a lot of pain, that doesn't do it for me the way something that is like torture that would have pain that would happen in real life, I guess. It seems like mainstream comic books keep getting more and more violent. In fact, and I felt guilty because I was planning to do this video that was mostly negative about violence in comics. And I was watching the latest comic book roundtable and Scott Constant Brown Star's channel, and Scott was saying, I've noticed that coming back to DC Comics, they're way more violent than they used to be, and that's awesome. And I can totally understand that. I mean, there's sort of some fun in certain kinds of violence. But on the other hand, is it also a bad sign for comics in general? Because you're going to get even more of that stuff of people pick up a comic book for their kid and go, oh my God, and it's like, we're never going into a comic book shop again. I have to be careful about clone laying around. I have, for my daughter or even my wife seeing it, 'cause she's quite sensitive about violence. But, if someone picked up Ghosted, my daughter picked up Ghosted and asked me what's happening on the first page, she's not old enough. I could lie to her because she's not old enough to figure out by the context of what she can see the face with suffering on it, I suppose. And she has occasionally flipped through things that not as bad as either of those, but flipped through things that I kind of wished she hadn't seen. I think that I could enjoy comics the exact same way I do now, with a little less blood and guts. So anyway, that's just kind of where I stand right now. And part of it certainly does have to do with being a parent who wants to have comic books around the house. And part of it, because when things cross a certain line, I don't enjoy it. I just have strong reactions to things if the tone is wrong. Comic Book Crack does a lot of videos about transgressive comics. He's kind of a collector, I believe, tell me if I got it wrong, of things that are transgressive anyway. And in certain contexts, and everything he's shown, I think that's really cool. And he keeps it all on the high shelves where his son can't see it, etc. So I accept all of that, and yet there's this, when the transgressiveness gets closer and closer to the mainstream comics, then I get more and more uneasy. Saga is great, it's one of my favorite comics, but it definitely has pushed the limits in a number of times, and it is a little bit weird to think of it just sitting innocently on the shelves for anyone to pick up along with all the other comic books. And I also feel uneasy that over time, sort of more extreme things just become more and more part of the norm. It feels good to me to have extreme things be separate from the norm and be over in a different category. And then I feel very hypocritical or shallow saying something like that. But, I appreciate adult things. I'm glad that I missed adult things when I was a kid. There's a few adult things. Luckily, when I grew up, the violence level wasn't as high. There was a few kind of weird books about sex that I read when I was pretty young and got some wrong ideas about sex. It's good to get things at the right time in your life. But for me, there's no time in my life where I really want in-depth torture. Anyhow, I feel like there's something else I say. I mean, the irony is I'm totally glad that I can pick up Richard Corbin in color comics that look like regular comic books. But he kind of has often been quite a transgressive comic book artist. Actually, it's kind of funny. I was trying to explain to Matt, Agent 42Q, Wednesday Serial now, about Richard Corbin, and I sent him to a link with some images from his famous comic book Den. And Matt wrote me back saying, well, I don't really like gay porn. So, because Den is full of bizarre images of naked men with extreme appendages. But, so I had to try to explain to him that that's not what it really was about. Maybe the overly easy access to more extreme porn on the internet has made everybody, or a lot of people's line that they draw, move up up to different areas of what's acceptable to show or treat lightly. So yeah, in fact, some internet porn that I've stumbled across a few times has made me much more pro censorship than normal old-fashioned porn would. I used to be pretty pro porn in a way back before the internet. I just thought men are visual and that's what they need. But anyway, that's a whole nother subject. Yeah, so that's just my thought for the day. There are comic books that cross the line for me violent-wise. I know a lot of people have been liking Ghosted, and I like what I've read other than that first splash page. So I think I'll keep reading the first 2 issues that I bought, and if I like them, I'll probably pick up issue 3. Just as a side note, it seems like there's lots of comics now that are trying to do Ocean's 11, and that Ghosted is Ocean's 11, but the heist is to catch a ghost. How many Ocean's 11 stories do we want? Is that like a major... For some reason, it seems to attract comic book writers doing Image Comics and other indie comics. Is that because that's a really great plot, or is it kind of an easy plot to put together that's still fun? Another topic, I guess. I haven't been posting videos every day, but I actually made them every day. But 2 of them, Sunday and Monday, I made them, and then I made the mistake of listening to what I did, and I decided not to put them up. So I will actually return to those. One of them is all about Conan, a very violent comic that I find acceptable for some reason. Violent and sexist. And yet I can be comfortable with it. Why? I don't know. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.